She crossed the entire West for a husband, and the man wouldn't even look her in the eye. Clara Whitmore stepped off that train with one wooden trunk, $11, and a letter that had promised her a life. William Carter looked at her worn boots, her mended dress, her hands that had known nothing but hard work, and said in front of every soul on that platform, "I don't think this arrangement will work." 1,000 miles. Everything she owned sold. Every bridge burned behind her. And the man she had crossed the West to marry turned his back on her before she could say a single word about who she actually was. She did not fall apart. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel, follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The train had been 3 days late out of Chicago. Clara Whitmore had spent those 3 days sitting in a wooden seat that offered no cushion, watching the landscape outside her window change from the green hills of the east into something flatter, wider, and more indifferent than anything she had ever known. The other passengers around her talked about opportunity. They talked about land and cattle prices and the future opening up like a door. Clara didn't talk to anyone. She held the letter in her lap, the letter from William Carter of Red Hollow, Montana, and she read it again and again until she had memorized every word of it, not because the words were beautiful, but because she needed something to hold on to. The letter had been straightforward. A rancher, a good property, a man of means looking for a capable woman to manage his household. There had been nothing romantic about it, and Clara had not expected romance. She had expected honesty. She had expected a man who would keep his word because his word was the only reason she was on this train at all. She had sold her father's pocket watch to buy the ticket. That was the last thing she had sold. Before the watch, she had sold the quilt her mother made the winter before she died. Before the quilt, she had sold the small set of china that survived every difficult year of her childhood. Before the china, she had sold 3 of her 4 dresses, keeping only the 2 most practical ones. Both of them faded and mended at the elbows. When the debt collectors came for the farm, they took the land and the barn and the livestock, and they would have taken the furniture too, if her neighbor Mrs. Abbott hadn't helped her carry the best pieces to the church before the men arrived with their paperwork. Clara was 25 years old, and she owned 1 trunk, 2 dresses, a pair of worn boots, a Bible, a small tin of dried lavender her mother had kept on the kitchen windowsill, and a letter from a man she had never met who had promised her a life. She was not afraid. She had already lived through the worst things she could imagine, and she had survived all of them. What she felt instead, sitting on that train with the West opening up around her, was something quieter and more dangerous than fear. She felt hope. And she understood the way a person understands something they have learned through pain rather than wisdom, that hope was the most fragile thing a person could carry. She told herself not to hold it too tightly. She held it tightly anyway. Red Hollow Station was smaller than she had imagined. The platform was raw lumber bleached silver by sun and weather, and the town beyond it was a single main street with a general store, a saloon, a church at one end, and a livery stable at the other. When the train pulled in and the conductor called the stop, Clara was the only passenger who stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress, tucked a loose strand of dark hair back beneath her hat, picked up her trunk with both hands. It was heavy, even mostly empty, and walked to the door. The platform was crowded for a small station. She didn't understand why until she stepped down and felt the quality of the silence that fell over the assembled people, and realized they had come to see the mail-order bride arrive. Of course they had. In a town this size, it was the most interesting thing that would happen all month. She set the trunk down and looked for William Carter. She had no photograph of him, and he had sent none, but she had expected a man who would step forward, who would introduce himself, who would behave like someone expecting a guest. She scanned the platform. There was a group of ranch hands leaning against the far railing, all of them looking at her with the careful sideways attention of men who wanted to stare but knew better. There was a woman in a green dress who whispered something to the woman beside her. There was the station master with his ledger. There was a man in a good coat and polished boots standing slightly apart from everyone else looking at the ground. Clara looked at the man in the good coat. He was perhaps 45, heavy through the shoulders. He had the look of a prosperous man, the kind of prosperity that shows itself in small details, the quality of the fabric, the clean line of a hat that cost more than most men earned in a week. He was looking at the ground with the specific expression of a man who has just decided something and is waiting for the moment when he will have to say it out loud. Clara knew that expression. She had seen it on the faces of men who came to the farm after her father died. Men who had borrowed money or made promises, and were now calculating whether the woman standing in front of them could do anything about it if they didn't follow through. She walked toward him anyway. "Mr. Carter," she said. He looked up. His eyes moved over her with the fast assessing efficiency of a man at an auction, and she watched his expression close. Not unkind exactly, just decided. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I am," she said. "Clara Whitmore, from Baltimore." "Yes." He cleared his throat. He looked at the trunk. He looked at her dress. He looked at her face, and then away from her face back toward the street. "I received your letter." "And I received yours," Clara said. Another pause. The kind of pause that had weight to it. "I'll speak plainly," William Carter said. He had the voice of a man who was used to people listening when he spoke, not because he was eloquent, but because he controlled too many things in too small a valley for people to risk not listening. "I placed that advertisement with certain expectations about the kind of woman who would respond." Clara waited. "You understand," he said. "A ranch my size, the social obligations. There are expectations from the community about what kind of woman would be a suitable match for a man in my position." "I understood the advertisement to describe a man looking for a capable and hardworking woman," Clara said. Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. "Yes, well." He shifted his weight. He was embarrassed, she realized. Not embarrassed enough to behave differently, but embarrassed enough to feel it. "The fact is, I was also expecting there were some indications in your letter about your family background that I may have misinterpreted. And looking at that is to say, I don't think this arrangement will work." And there it was. Said loud. Said clearly. Said in a place where everyone could hear. Clara stood very still. She heard the silence that came after his words. She heard underneath the silence the beginning of the whispers, the rustle of conversation that travels through a group of people who have just witnessed something they will be discussing for weeks. She heard a woman's voice low and not quite quiet enough. "Poor thing, came all this way for nothing." She heard someone else laugh, a short sound quickly cut off. She felt the weight of every eye on the platform settle onto her, the way a heavy blanket settles pressing down. She picked up her trunk. She did not look at the ground. She looked at William Carter directly, and she kept her voice steady and clear, because she wanted every person on that platform to hear this part just as clearly as they had heard his. "Thank you for being honest, Mr. Carter," she said. "I am sorry we misunderstood each other. I hope you find the woman you're looking for." Then she turned away from him. She did not run. She walked her trunk in both hands toward the edge of the platform, and she was thinking, not about William Carter, not about the people watching, but about the practical problem directly in front of her. She had $11. The return ticket to Baltimore would cost more than that. She did not know a single person in the state of Montana. She did not know what the next hour would look like, let alone the next day. She was thinking so hard about the problem that she almost didn't hear the voice. "Ma'am." It came from the side of the platform near the far end where the crowd thinned out. A man's voice. Deep. Not loud, but the kind of voice that carries anyway, the way a calm voice sometimes carries further than a raised one. Clara stopped. She turned. Howe was standing apart from everyone else, leaning against one of the platform posts, with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He was taller than Carter by a good 4 inches, and lean in a way that suggested it wasn't by choice, but by consequence, the way men get lean when they work hard and live alone and don't always remember to eat. He wore a plain coat, dark with trail dust. His hat was the hat of a working man, not a wealthy one. His face was weathered in a way that made him look older than he might have been, with deep lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun. Howe was not handsome in any obvious or easy way. But there was something in how he stood very still, very contained, as though he had made a decision not to take up more space in the world than he absolutely needed to, that made Clara stop walking. "A woman who travels that far alone," he said, "deserves better than being left standing in the dirt." The whispers on the platform went quiet. Everyone looked at him. Clara looked at him. "That's kind of you to say," she said. "It isn't kindness," he said. "It's plain fact." He pushed himself off the post and walked toward her with a slow, deliberate step. He stopped a respectful distance away and extended his hand not to take her trunk, but to shake hers. "Ethan Walker. I run a ranch up in the northern hills. Small operation. Nothing like Carter's spread." She shook his hand. His grip was brief and firm, and he let go immediately, which she noticed. Men who wanted something tended to hold on a little longer than necessary. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard." He glanced down at her trunk and then back up at her face. "You have a plan for what comes next." "I'm working on one," Clara said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the recognition of an honest answer. "I need help at my place," he said. "House management. Cooking. I lost my mother 3 years ago, and the house has been—" He stopped, started again. "It's been neglected. I can offer a fair wage, your own room with a lock on the door, and 3 months of honest work. If you want to leave after that, I'll help you buy a ticket to wherever you want to go." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The people around them had gone very quiet. She could feel them listening. She could feel Carter somewhere behind her watching. "You're not offering marriage," she said. "No," he said. "I'm offering work. What you do after that is your business. You don't know anything about me." "I know what I just watched," he said. "That told me enough." Clara was quiet for another moment. She had spent 3 days on a train holding hope, carefully telling herself not to trust it. She was looking at a stranger in a dusty coat who was offering her something she had not expected to find anywhere in this territory. Not rescue, not charity, not a proposition, just a door that was standing open. "All right," she said. 3 months. 3 months, he agreed. He picked up her trunk without asking and started toward the end of the platform. Clara fell into step beside him, and behind them she heard the crowd on the platform beginning to talk again. She heard Carter's voice among the others, saying something sharp and dismissive that she decided not to listen to. She kept walking. The wagon that Ethan Walker drove was not impressive. It was a working wagon, the kind that had been repaired in several places with whatever material was available at the time, and the seat had a crack running through the middle of it that Clara carefully avoided putting direct weight on. The horse was a sturdy gray mare, older patient, in a way that spoke of long experience carrying heavy loads over difficult country. They drove in silence for the first mile. Clara had noticed already that Ethan Walker was not a man who filled silence with noise. Most people were uncomfortable with silence and tried to cover it. He seemed to regard it as a natural condition, no different from breathing. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she didn't mind. She was the one who finally spoke. "How far is your ranch?" "About an hour and a half," he said. "Longer in bad weather. The road gets rough past the first ridge." "How long have you been there?" "Came with my family when I was 11, he said. "My father built the main house. My mother planted the garden. My father died when I was 22, and I've been running it since." "Alone." "I have 3 hired hands," he said. "Good men. They've been with me long enough that they know the land." "You don't have family nearby?" He glanced at her sideways. "No." Clara accepted this. She looked at the landscape around them, the wide open of the lower valley, beginning to give way to a rougher country, the hills ahead rising dark with pine. "I should tell you," she said, "that I'm not what Carter was looking for." "I could see that," Ethan said. "He was looking for a woman who could help him impress people at a dinner table. That's not the same as a capable woman." "I grew up on a farm," Clara said. "I know how to work. I can keep accounts, cook, preserve food, manage supplies. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I know," he said. "You couldn't know that yet," she said. "The way you picked up that trunk," he said, "and the way you walked away from Carter. Both of those things told me something. Clara looked at him. What did they tell you? That you're not performing, he said. Some women in that situation would have cried. Some would have argued. Some would have looked around to find someone who would fix it for them. You picked up your trunk and you started solving the problem. Clara turned this over in her mind. I've had a lot of practice, she said finally. I figured, he said. They didn't speak again until they reached the first ridge, and by then the sun was lower and the air had changed cooler, sharper, carrying the smell of pine and something else underneath it that Clara couldn't name, but that felt improbably like a place she might be able to breathe. Walker Ranch was not what she expected. She had imagined something either better or worse, either a prosperous spread that would make her feel out of place, or a ruin that would confirm her worst fears. What she found was neither. It was a working ranch that had once been cared for and was now simply tired. The main house was solidly built, big enough with good bones, but the porch needed attention, and the garden that she could see along the south wall had gone completely to weeds and drought. The barn was well maintained. She could see the priority that represented immediately, and the fencing along the front was new or newish. The 3 hired hands were waiting in the yard when the wagon pulled in. They had the wary, measuring look of men who had been told something was changing, but hadn't been told what, and were trying to decide in advance whether they would approve of it. The first one, young, maybe 20, with a gap between his front teeth and hair that couldn't decide what direction to go, introduced himself as Tommy. He had an openness to his face that Clara liked immediately. The second was older, perhaps 50, quiet and solid, with a way of standing that suggested he had seen most things and was not easily impressed. His name was Joseph. The third was somewhere in between, barrel-chested and watchful, with the kind of face that took its time before giving anything away. He said his name was Hector. None of them quite knew where to look when Ethan introduced Clara, not as a wife, not as a guest, but simply as Clara Whitmore. She'll be managing the house. Treat her with respect. The word respect, delivered in that flat, certain way, settled something in the air. Tommy immediately offered to carry her trunk. Joseph nodded once, which Clara was coming to understand was the equivalent of a speech. Hector watched her for a moment longer than the others, and then said, "I'll put the mare up," and led the horse away. The house itself told her everything she needed to know about the 3 years since Ethan's mother had died. Not that it was dirty, it was clean enough in the way that men who care about practical things keep things clean, meaning nothing was rotting and everything was functional. But there was no warmth to it. The curtains were stiff with disuse. The pantry was organized by someone who thought about food in terms of survival rather than pleasure. There were no flowers, no color beyond the functional, no small evidence anywhere that someone had thought about what it might feel like to sit in a room at the end of a hard day. Clara stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it all. "It's a good house," she said. "It needs work," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "It does." She set her small bag down on the table. "I'll start in the morning." "You can start whenever you're ready," he said. "There's no rush." She looked at him. "There's always a rush," she said. "The longer you leave things, the harder they are to fix. That's true of houses, and I expect it's true of most things." He looked at her for a moment. With that expression, she was beginning to recognize the slight pause, the recalibration, the quiet acknowledgement of something that had surprised him. "Your room is at the end of the hall," he said. "There's a latch on the inside of the door." "You mentioned that," she said. "I wanted to make sure you understood it was there," he said. "That it would stay there. That no one would ever suggest otherwise." Clara met his eyes. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it in a way that went past courtesy, because she understood that he was telling her something specific and important, that this was an arrangement between adults, that her safety was not in question, that she could close the door at the end of the night and know it would hold. She slept better that night than she had slept in months. She was woken before dawn by the sound of the ranch coming to life. The horses in the barn, the low voices of the men beginning their morning work, the creak of the house settling in the cold. She dressed quickly, started a fire in the kitchen stove, and began making an inventory of the pantry. By the time Ethan came in for breakfast, there was hot coffee on the table. eggs, bread she had found flour to make before sunrise, and a list on a piece of paper beside his plate. He looked at the list. "What is this?" "What we need," Clara said. "The pantry is missing several basics. Some of them I can work around for a week, but not much longer. Some of them we need before the end of the month, or we'll be in trouble when the weather turns." He picked up the list and read it. She watched his face. "This is thorough," he said. "There's more," she said. "The kitchen garden is gone, but the soil looks good. If we start now, we can still get some late crops in before frost. The curtains in the main room are beyond saving, but the rods are fine, and I can make new ones if you have fabric or can get it. The porch railing on the south side is one bad winter away from coming down, and if someone leans against it wrong before then, they're going to get hurt." Ethan put the list down. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time, that measuring, careful, unhurried look. "You did all of this before sunrise," he said. "I couldn't sleep past 4, she said. "I never could." "My mother was the same way," he said. And something in his voice shifted when he said it. Something that she filed away carefully, because it told her something important about what had been missing in this house for 3 years. "Tell me about your mother," Clara said. Howe was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "She was a practical woman," he said finally. "She didn't talk much about feelings. She showed things, the way a room was kept, what she planted in the garden, the way she'd sit with you if you were sick, not saying anything, just there." He looked down at his coffee. "When she died, the house stopped feeling like anything." "I know what that's like," Clara said quietly. He looked up at her. "My mother died when I was 17, she said. "My father kept working the farm for 8 more years, but the house was never—" She stopped. It was never quite right after that. There was a silence between them that was different from the silences they'd had before. This one had something in it, some warm current under the surface. "You should eat," Clara said. "It'll get cold." "Yes," he said, and he picked up his fork. The first week at Walker Ranch was the hardest week of Clara's life that didn't involve a funeral. She had underestimated how much had been allowed to slip. Not the obvious things, though those she had identified and addressed quickly, but the accumulated small neglects that took longer to see. The smokehouse needed resealing before they could use it properly. The root cellar had a water problem. 3 of the kitchen windows had gaps where they met the frames, which in winter would make the room miserable and the food spoilage rapid. She worked from before sunrise until after dark every day. Tommy helped her when he wasn't needed elsewhere, and she found herself liking him more with every hour. He was cheerful, without being foolish, willing, without being sycophantic, and he had a good eye for what needed doing, even if he needed to be told first. Joseph, she saw less of, but he appeared at strategic moments to move heavy things without being asked, which she suspected was Ethan's doing rather than coincidence. Hector remained watchful, saying little, but she noticed that he began leaving small things for her. A bucket of water closer to the kitchen door, wood stacked where she didn't have to go as far to get it, adjustments, so practical and so quietly made that she wasn't sure at first if they were intentional. She decided to say something about it. "Hector," she said one afternoon, catching him on his way between the barn and the fence line. "The wood and the water yesterday morning, that was you." He stopped. He had the face of a man calculating how much to admit. "Water's heavy," he said finally. "Seemed inefficient." "It was kind," Clara said. "I appreciate it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I thought you'd be," he said. "When Walker told us he was bringing back a woman from town, I thought—" He stopped. "You thought I'd be a burden," Clara said. "I thought you'd last 2 weeks," he said. "I apologize for that." "Don't apologize," Clara said. "I'd have thought the same thing. I'll take the honest version over a polite lie every time." Something in Hector's face relaxed. "Week 3, he said. "For what it's worth." "I'll take it," Clara said. The community of Red Hollow made its opinion known in the second week. It arrived in the form of 2 women from town, the wives of men who owned neighboring properties, who appeared at the front gate with a pie and the specific brightness of people who have come to assess rather than to welcome. Their names were Martha Greer and Susan Aldrich, and they were perfectly pleasant in a way that had teeth behind it. "We heard you came in on Wednesday's train," Martha Greer said. She had sharp eyes and a sweet voice, and knew how to use both at once. "I did," Clara said. She invited them in, put water on for tea, and listened. "And you'll be staying at Walker Ranch," Susan Aldrich said. "In what capacity?" "Household management," Clara said. "Not married then," Martha said. "Not married," Clara said. "How unusual," Martha said with a tone that made unusual do a great deal of work. "Mr. Walker needed help with the house," Clara said. "I needed work. It seemed a practical solution for both of us." "Practical," Martha repeated. She exchanged a look with Susan that Clara noted precisely. "The pie looks wonderful," Clara said. "Did you make it yourself?" Martha paused. "I did." "I'd love the recipe sometime," Clara said. "I've been working on restoring the kitchen garden. I think I can get some late apples from the trees on the south side if the weather holds." And she kept the conversation there on the practical, the domestic, the things that gave Martha and Susan nothing to work with. By the time they left, she had complimented the pie 3 times, learned something useful about where to buy the best preserving jars in Red Hollow, and established the impression of a woman whose life was too full of honest work to be worth scandalizing. That night, Ethan asked her how the visit went. "They came to decide whether I was a problem," Clara said, "and their conclusion—" "I think they haven't decided yet," Clara said. "But they couldn't find anything obvious to object to, which is a start." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You know what people think," he said, "about you being here." "I know what some people think," Clara said. "I also know that what people think matters less than what's actually true. And what's actually true is that your smokehouse now holds properly, and your root cellar is dry for the first time in probably 2 seasons, and your men have had a hot meal every night this week. People can think whatever they like." Ethan looked at her. "My mother would have liked you," he said. Clara looked down at her tea. "That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me since I left Baltimore," she said. It was at the end of the 3rd week that she first saw Red Storm. She had gone out early to check on the garden and had gone further than she intended, following the fence line to where it curved around the eastern pasture. And there he was. How was magnificent. And she felt it physically, the way you sometimes feel a thing before you understand it. The wild chestnut stallion standing at the far end of the pasture, not grazing, not moving, simply standing and watching her the way she was watching him. He was bigger than the ranch horses, differently built, with the look of a horse that had never fully accepted the idea of being owned by anyone. She heard Tommy come up beside her. "Red Storm," he said. There was something in his voice, respect and wariness mixed together. "Ethan brought him in last spring from a wild herd up in the hills. Thought he could work him down. Nobody can." "What's he doing in the pasture?" "He's there when he wants to be and gone when he doesn't," Tommy said. "We put him in the pen 3 times and he got out 3 times. Nobody's been able to explain it. So Ethan just lets him come and go." Clara watched the horse. "What happened to him?" she said. Tommy looked at her sideways. "What do you mean?" "Something happened to him," Clara said. "A horse doesn't look like that from nothing. That's not just wild, that's careful. That's a horse that decided a long time ago that people weren't safe." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Previous owner was rough with him," he said. "That's what Walker heard. Before that, nobody knows." "No," Clara said. "Nobody ever knows." She did not approach the horse that day. She came back the next morning before the sun was fully up and stood at the fence and simply looked at him across the distance. Red Storm stood and looked back. Neither of them moved. She came back the next day, and the day after. On the 4th morning, she brought an apple from the kitchen, not to offer it, just to hold it, to stand there with it in her hand as something real and ordinary. Red Storm watched her from 30 feet away. On the 5th morning, he was 15 feet away. She didn't move toward him. She had learned early in her life that the quickest way to make something afraid of you was to move faster than it was ready for. She waited. She let the distance close itself on his terms. Ethan saw her standing at the fence on the 6th morning. He came and stood beside her, saying nothing, and they both watched the stallion, who was now close enough that Clara could see the fine details of him. The scar along his left flank, old and healed, but there the slight tension in how he held himself even when he appeared calm. "He won't let anyone near him," Ethan said, quietly. "Not a warning, just a fact." "Not yet," Clara said. "I've had 2 experienced trainers try," Ethan said. He put one of them over the fence. "They probably moved too fast," Clara said. "Probably," Ethan said. They stood in silence for a while. "He's not cruel," Clara said. "He's guarded. There's a difference. Cruel animals look for the chance to hurt you. He's just protecting himself." Ethan looked at her. She was looking at the horse. "He's not wild because he wants to be," she said. "He's wild because it's the only thing that kept him safe." There was a long pause. "You might be the most perceptive person I've ever met," Ethan said, "or the most foolish." "People keep saying that about me," Clara said. "So far, I've always turned out to be the first one." Something shifted at the corner of Ethan's mouth, that almost smile she was learning to read. "Be careful," he said. But it wasn't a command. It was something softer than that. Something that sounded, if she listened closely enough, almost like concern. She came back to the fence the next morning, and Red Storm took 3 steps toward her. She held out her hand, not the apple, just her empty hand, and waited. The stallion stretched his neck and breathed against her palm. Clara stood very still and felt the breath against her skin, and understood in a way that went straight past thinking and directly into something deeper, that she and this horse had come to the same place from different roads, but they had both arrived at the same question, whether trust once broken could ever really be rebuilt. Whether the risk of reaching out was worth what might happen if someone pulled away again. She kept her hand steady. Red Storm kept breathing, and somewhere behind her, she knew without turning around that Ethan Walker was watching, and that what he was seeing was not just a woman with a horse. Red Storm let her touch him on the 7th morning. Not for long, not calmly. His whole body went rigid the moment her fingers made contact with the side of his neck, and she felt the tension run through him like a current. Every muscle poised to bolt, every instinct screaming at him to get away from the hand that was touching him. But he didn't bolt. He stood there shaking slightly, and let her hand rest against his neck for 3 seconds before he stepped backward and put distance between them again. 3 seconds. Clara let out a slow breath and stepped back too, giving him the space he needed, and she was thinking about those 3 seconds. The way you think about something that matters more than it should. Turning it over, examining it, understanding what it cost him to stay still for that long, when everything inside him was telling him to run. Tommy saw it from 20 yards away, and let out a sound that was half laugh and half something he couldn't name. "3 weeks ago, that horse put a man twice your size over the fence," he said. "That man moved too fast," Clara said. "You barely moved at all." "That's the point," she said. She went back to the house, started breakfast, and didn't think about Red Storm again until Ethan came in from his early round and poured himself coffee and stood at the window the way he sometimes did when he was thinking about something he hadn't decided to say yet. "He let you touch him," Ethan said. "He hadn't been there. She hadn't told him." "Tommy talks," Clara said. "Tommy talks." Ethan agreed. He turned from the window. "How did you know he would—" "I didn't," Clara said. "I just kept showing up." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Most people would have given up after the 3rd morning. "Most people expect results before they've done the work," Clara said. "I stopped expecting that a while ago." He looked at her with that steady, careful gaze of his, the one that didn't judge and didn't look away and didn't fill itself with assumptions. "What made you stop?" he said. Clara set the bread pan down on the table. "My father got sick 2 years before he died," she said. "I spent those 2 years believing that if I worked hard enough and managed carefully enough and did everything right, I could hold everything together. The farm, the finances, his health." She paused. "You can do everything right and still lose. I learned that. After I learned it, I stopped measuring myself by results and started measuring by effort. The only thing I can actually control is whether I keep showing up." Ethan set his coffee cup down slowly. "That's a hard thing to learn," he said. Most true things are, she said. He picked his cup back up, looked into it, looked back at her. My father used to say that the land doesn't care how hard you try, he said. He meant it as a warning. Like, don't get soft, don't expect fairness. But I think he was also saying something else. That the work itself is worth doing. Not because it pays off, just because it's honest. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, Clara said. He was a hard man, Ethan said. Whether that's the same thing, I'm still deciding. It was the most he had said about his father in the 5 weeks since she arrived. Clara filed it carefully the way she was building a picture of Ethan Walker from the small pieces he let fall, not because she was looking for anything particular in the picture, but because understanding a person was the only honest way to live alongside them. The trouble with Red Hollow arrived as most trouble did, without warning. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the 5th week. Clara was in the root cellar checking the preserves she'd put up the week before when she heard the wagon come into the yard. Not Ethan's wagon, not any of the ranch's horses, but something heavier, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted to be seen and heard arriving. She came up from the cellar to find William Carter standing in the yard. He had brought one of his ranch hands with him, a large man, whose name she didn't know, standing slightly behind and to the left, in the way that men stand when they're there to provide a certain kind of emphasis. Carter himself was in a good coat again, his hat clean, his expression arranged into something that was trying to be pleasant and not quite succeeding. Tommy was at the barn door, very still watching. Clara walked out of the cellar entrance and into the yard and stopped. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He looked her over with that quick, assessing glance she remembered from the train platform. "You look well. Hard work agrees with you, I see." "It always has," Clara said. "I heard you've settled in here," he said. "Getting along well with Walker's men. Making yourself useful." She waited. "The thing is," Carter said, shifting his weight slightly, "I may have made a hasty judgment at the station. I'd like the opportunity to revisit our original arrangement." Clara looked at him. She took one breath, then another. Because what she felt in that moment, the immediate physical reaction to those words, was not the thing she wanted to act from. What she felt was something that started cold and moved quickly into heat. A clean, bright anger that she recognized as valid and chose very deliberately to speak through rather than around. "You told me in front of 50 people that our arrangement wouldn't work," she said. Her voice was level. "You waited until I had traveled 1,000 miles and stepped off the train before you said it. You made that decision publicly and loudly, and then you watched me walk away." Carter's expression tightened. "I've reconsidered." "Why?" Clara said. He blinked. "Why have you reconsidered?" she said. "What has changed about me in 5 weeks that you found insufficient when I arrived?" I was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the pleasantness in his voice had worn somewhat thinner. "I've heard that you're managing Walker's place well," he said. "Word travels in a small valley. I was perhaps too hasty in your assessment of my value," Clara said. "You mean you were too hasty in deciding I wasn't worth anything to you, and now that other people have found me worth something you'd like to reconsider?" Carter's face darkened. The large man behind him shifted his feet. "That's a sharp way to put it," Carter said. "It's the honest way to put it," Clara said. "I'm sorry to be blunt, but I made a decision 5 weeks ago about the kind of life I wanted here, and that decision wasn't made lightly. I'm not in the habit of reconsidering things simply because someone else has." "You're a practical woman," Carter said. "My ranch is larger. My resources are not the point," Clara said. "Everything is a point when you're talking about your future." "Mr. Carter," she said, and something in her voice changed. Not louder, just settled the way a wall settles into its foundation. "I came to Montana looking for a home. What I found in 5 weeks here is something that took me 25 years not to find back east. I found people who treat me with respect and give me honest work and don't measure my worth by my family's money or my dress or my connections. I wouldn't trade that for any size of ranch." Carter stared at her. She met his stare without flinching. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. It was a short laugh, not kind, but not entirely hostile, either the laugh of a man encountering something that genuinely surprised him. "Walker doesn't deserve that kind of loyalty," he said. "He doesn't appreciate what he has." "That," Clara said quietly, "is not something you'd know." She heard boots on the porch steps then, and Ethan came around the corner of the house with the easy stride of someone who is moving faster than he appears to be. He took in the scene in a single glance. Carter, the ranch hand, Clara standing in the yard with her arms at her sides, and something in his face went very still and very deliberate. "Carter," he said. "Walker." Carter's voice had changed. There was an edge in it now, an old edge, the kind that tells you an argument has a history. "Just paying a social call." "On my property," Ethan said, not a question. "On Miss Whitmore," Carter said. "She's not your property." "No," Ethan said. "She isn't. She makes her own choices. Looks like she already made them." He glanced at Clara. Clara nodded once. "I'll see you out, Carter," Ethan said. Carter looked between them. Something crossed his face, not anger exactly, but the frustrated recognition of a man who has miscalculated, and he settled his hat and turned back toward his wagon. But he stopped before he climbed up. "You're a fool, Walker," he said without turning around. "You've got something good, and you don't even know what to do with it." Ethan said nothing. Carter climbed up, turned the wagon, and drove out of the yard. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Tommy let out a breath from the barn doorway that seemed to release something from the whole yard. Ethan looked at Clara. "You all right?" he said. "Just that. No drama. No speech." "Yes," she said. "Thank you for coming when you did." "I came when I heard the wagon," he said. "But you'd already handled it." "Mostly," she said. "You didn't need me," he said. She looked at him steadily. "That doesn't mean I didn't want you there," she said. And she turned and went back into the house before either of them could figure out what to do with that. The truth about Walker Ranch. Clara was discovering was that it was a place that had been holding its breath for 3 years. Since Ethan's mother died, the ranch had functioned. It had produced. The animals were healthy, the land was worked, the accounts were kept. But functioning was not the same as living, and the difference was something Clara understood in her bones, because she had spent 8 years on her father's farm after her mother died doing exactly the same thing, maintaining, managing, keeping the shape of a life intact, while quietly grieving the warmth that had gone out of it. She began putting the warmth back in small ways. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way you bring heat back into a cold room, steadily, patiently letting it spread on its own. She put dried herbs in the window of the kitchen, the way her mother had done. She found fabric in the dry goods store in Red Hollow, and made curtains for the main room in a dark gold that made the afternoon light do something generous when it came through. She learned which songs the men liked and hummed them sometimes in the kitchen in the evenings, not performing anything, just letting the sound be there. She started a separate ledger for household accounts, showed it to Ethan every week, and made sure the numbers made sense, even to someone who found numbers tedious. Ethan watched all of this the way he watched most things, carefully, without commentary, absorbing. But things were shifting. She could feel it in the small ways he had started to change his habits. He had begun coming in for the midday meal, instead of having Tommy bring something out to him at the far fence line. He asked her opinion when he hadn't before, about things that weren't strictly the house. Whether the late hay crop was worth the effort given what the weather looked like. Whether one of the ranch hand's horses seemed off to her, or whether he was imagining it. He started leaving the office door open in the evenings, instead of closing it the way he had closed everything in his life for 3 years. Clara noticed all of it. She didn't say anything about any of it. But on a Thursday evening in the 6th week, Hector appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was cleaning up from dinner and stood there long enough that she looked up. "Something on your mind, Hector?" "Just thinking," he said. "That's a habit I support," she said. He almost smiled. "Walker's different," he said. "Since you came." Clara kept washing the pan. "Different how?" "He came out to the south fence last Tuesday," Hector said. "Just to help with the stringing. He hasn't done that in 2 years. Always said he had too much in the books to step away from. But he was out there for 3 hours." He paused. He was in a good mood. Clara said nothing. First time I've seen that in a while, Hector said. Hard work in good company tends to do that, Clara said. Hector looked at her for a long moment. You know what you've done here, he said. I want to say that, because somebody should. Clara stopped washing the pan. She turned and looked at him. You didn't fix it, Hector said carefully. You didn't come in and start telling everyone what was wrong and what needed changing. You just started doing the work, and the place followed you. Clara looked down at the pan in her hands. My mother taught me that, she said. She said if you want to change the feeling of a place, don't argue with it. Just love it honestly, and it'll come around. Hector was quiet. She sounds like she was worth knowing, he said. She was the best person I ever knew, Clara said. She went back to washing the pan, and Hector went back out to the barn, and the evening settled around the house in the particular way that evenings settle when a place has been reminded that it's capable of being warm. What she had not anticipated was Joseph. Of the three ranch hands, Joseph was the one she had understood least, not because he was unfriendly, but because he gave so little away. His conversation reduced to the minimum number of words that could accomplish necessary communication and no more. She had decided early that this was simply his nature and stopped trying to interpret it as anything personal. So, she was not prepared for what happened on the morning of the 7th week when she came out early to find Joseph sitting on the porch step with something in his hands waiting. It was a letter. He held it toward her when she appeared, and she saw immediately that his hands were not entirely steady. This was so unlike everything she had observed about Joseph that she took the letter carefully and sat down on the step beside him without being invited. Do you need me to read this? She said. He nodded once. She looked at the letter. It was from a woman named Alice in Kansas. The handwriting was deliberate and careful. The date was 3 weeks back. She read it. It was from his daughter. She had a child, a boy 7 months old now, Joseph's first grandchild. She had written to tell him. The letter was short, but it was full of the particular kind of tenderness that exists between people who have been estranged and are carefully trying to find their way back. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and held it out. You have a grandson, she said. Joseph took the letter. I can't read, he said. Just stated it flat and quiet with the matter-of-fact dignity of a man who has lived with a limitation long enough that he no longer puts effort into being ashamed of it. Been with Walker 6 years, he doesn't know. Does Ethan know about Alice? He knows I have a daughter, Joseph said. We don't talk about it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Would you like to write back to her? She said. Joseph looked at her. I can help you, Clara said. If you tell me what you want to say, I'll write it. In your words. You can read it back. I can read each sentence out loud as we go, and we can change anything that doesn't sound right to you. Joseph was still looking at her. Why? He said. Because you have a daughter in Kansas who wants to hear from her father, Clara said. And you have a grandson who doesn't know yet what kind of man his grandfather is. He should know. Something moved in Joseph's face that she had never seen there before. It was brief, and he controlled it quickly, but it was real. All right, he said. They sat on the porch step for 40 minutes, Joseph speaking in the low measured cadences of a man who chose every word the way you choose which boards will hold weight, and Clara writing it down, reading each sentence back to him, adjusting, refining. By the time the letter was finished, it was 3 paragraphs long, and it was one of the most honest pieces of writing Clara had ever been part of. It said almost nothing about himself and everything about how much he wanted to meet the boy. She addressed the envelope and left it with Joseph. When she came in for the midday meal, Ethan was already there, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Joseph told me, he said, about the letter. Clara got a glass of water. He told me he has a daughter, Ethan said. First time in 6 years he's mentioned her name. He wanted to, Clara said. He just needed someone to ask. Ethan was quiet. I should have asked, he said. You had things on your mind, Clara said. That's not an excuse, he said. There was something in his voice that was directed inward, a private accounting. I've been running this place like all that matters is the work. Like the people are just part of the work. My mother wasn't like that. She knew every man's name, knew his family, knew what he was worried about. He paused. I told myself I was keeping the ranch going for her sake. But the thing she actually cared about wasn't the land. No, Clara said. It wasn't. He looked at her. You sound sure about that, he said. The way you describe her, Clara said. The garden, sitting with you when you were sick. The way the house felt when she was in it. She wasn't keeping the ranch going. She was keeping the people going. The ranch was just the place they all happened to be. Ethan absorbed this. She watched him absorb it the way she watched most things about him, without pressure, without rushing him toward any particular conclusion. How do you know how to do this? He said. Do what? See people, he said. See what they need before they say it. Clara thought about her answer for a moment. I grew up in a house where nobody talked about what was actually wrong, she said. My parents were good people, hard workers, but they didn't say things, so I learned to watch instead. You can learn a lot about someone from what they don't say, what they don't do, where they don't look. She paused. It's not a gift. It's just practice at paying attention. Most people are too busy thinking about themselves to pay that kind of attention, Ethan said. I didn't have enough people in my life to afford not paying attention, Clara said. He looked at her with that expression, steady, careful, warmer than it used to be, though she didn't think he was aware of how much it had changed in 7 weeks. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. The 3 months, he said. You're about halfway through. I want to know whatever you decide whether you want to stay or go. I want you to know it changes nothing about what you're owed. Your wage, your room, any help you need to get wherever you want to go after. That doesn't depend on your answer. Clara set her glass down. That's not what you were going to ask, she said. He was quiet. What you actually wanted to ask, she said, is whether I'm thinking about leaving. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. I haven't been thinking about leaving, she said carefully. But I want to be honest with you about something. I came here without expectations, and I've tried very hard to keep it that way. Because I think expectations are how people get hurt when they decide what something means before it's ready to mean anything. He was listening intently. So I won't tell you what I want this to be, she said, because I don't think either of us knows that yet. What I can tell you is that this is the first place I've lived since my mother died where I don't feel like I'm holding my breath. A long silence. That's enough for now, Ethan said, quietly, like a man who has just been handed something fragile and is being very careful not to drop it. Yes, Clara said, it is. The letter Carter sent arrived 4 days later, not to Ethan, to Clara. Tommy brought it in from the mailbox with an uncertain expression and handed it to her without comment, and she took it to the kitchen and read it alone. It was not what she expected. It was not a renewed offer, not an apology. It was a piece of information delivered with the precise cruelty of a man who knows where to aim. Carter had discovered through some connection with a clerk in Baltimore that Clara's father had not merely lost the farm to debt. There had been a more specific disgrace involved, a failed business venture that her father had entered into with investors. Investors who had lost money, and the manner of the loss had attached a particular kind of shame to the Whitmore name in certain Baltimore circles. Carter laid it out in 2 paragraphs with the tone of someone doing her a favor. He suggested that it would be unfortunate if this information were to become widely known in Red Hollow. He noted that a community's opinion of a person could turn quickly on information of this kind. He concluded by writing that he would of course be discreet as he was a discreet man, and that he hoped she would be well. Clara read it twice. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving. She was not surprised that Carter had done this. She had recognized the shape of his character at the train station, and nothing since had changed her assessment. What she was doing sitting still was deciding. She could say nothing. She could wait to see if he was bluffing or if he would follow through. She could leave before it became a problem. Or she could do the thing that every instinct in her was pointing toward the thing that terrified her most, which was the only reliable indicator that it was the right thing to do. She could tell Ethan herself. She found him at the south fence line. She walked out to him, and she handed him the letter, and she stood and watched him read it. She watched his face change as he read. Not the surface of his face that stayed controlled the way his face always stayed controlled, but something underneath it, something that moved through him, the way weather moves through a valley, visible in the quality of the stillness it left behind. He folded the letter and looked at her. "Is it true?" he said. "My father made bad investments," she said. "He trusted people he shouldn't have trusted. People lost money. That's true." She kept her voice steady. "The way Carter's framing it isn't true. My father was not dishonest. He was too trusting and too proud to admit when things were going wrong. And then it was too late." Ethan was quiet. "I should have told you," she said. "When I first arrived. It wasn't fair to let you take me in without knowing." "Why didn't you?" he said. "Because I was afraid," she said. "And I'm telling you now because I'm more afraid of you finding out from someone else." He looked at her for a long time. "Do you think it changes anything?" he said. She held his gaze. "I don't know. Does it?" The wind moved through the grass around them. "Your father's business," Ethan said carefully, "is not your character." "I know that," she said. "But not everyone will agree with you." "Let them disagree," he said. His voice had not changed. It had the same flat, certain quality it had when he'd told his ranch hands to treat her with respect on the first day. "I don't run this ranch by committee." Clara felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was braced. "Carter is going to make trouble," she said. "Carter makes trouble for everyone who has something he wants," Ethan said. "He'll get bored if it doesn't work. And if it doesn't get boring." Ethan looked at her directly. "Then we'll deal with it," he said. The word "we" was said simply without ceremony, as though it were already settled, as though it had been settled for longer than either of them had noticed. Clara took the letter back from him. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She stood there for a moment in the wind and the wide-open silence of the valley, and she thought about the trunk she had carried across 1,000 miles, the pocket watch she had sold the farm that was gone, the name that Carter wanted to use as a weapon. She thought about 7 weeks of honest work and a wild horse breathing against her palm, and a grandson in Kansas, and curtains that let the afternoon light come through golden and warm. She thought about the word "we." "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Ethan said. "For not making me explain why it matters," she said. He nodded once, turned back to the fence, picked up his tools. And she stood there for 1 more minute in the afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the letter in her pocket, get lighter the way things do when you're no longer carrying them alone. Carter followed through on his threat on a Sunday. He chose Sunday deliberately after the church service, when the whole of Red Hollow's community was gathered in the yard outside the white clapboard building, still in their good clothes, still in the particular mood that church creates in small towns where everyone knows everyone and information travels faster than weather. Clara wasn't there. She hadn't been attending services regularly, partly because the ranch work didn't pause for Sundays, and partly because she was still finding her footing in the community and had not wanted to force herself into spaces where she wasn't sure of her welcome. She heard about it from Tommy, who came back from town with a face that told her everything before he opened his mouth. "You should know," he said. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, turning his hat in his hands the way he did when something was bothering him. "Carter was talking, after service, about your father, about Baltimore." Clara kept her hands steady on the bread she was shaping. "What did he say?" "That your family name had a scandal attached to it. That you came out west because you couldn't show your face back east anymore. That Walker didn't know what kind of woman he'd taken in." Tommy stopped. Mrs. Greer was listening, and Mrs. Aldrich, and maybe a dozen others. "Did anyone push back?" Clara said. Tommy was quiet a beat too long. "Reverend Hale told him it wasn't the time or place," he said finally. "But nobody, no, not really." Clara nodded. She finished shaping the bread and put it in the pan and didn't say another word about it, and Tommy stood in the doorway for a moment longer, uncertain, then quietly left. She heard him go back to the barn. She heard the familiar sounds of the ranch continuing around her, the horses, the distant sound of Joseph working at the fence on the north side, the wind against the kitchen window. She stood at the table and breathed. She was not surprised. She had known Carter would follow through. She had told Ethan as much. What she hadn't anticipated was the particular quality of the hurt, which was not the sharp hurt of a direct attack, but the slower, duller hurt of knowing that a room full of people who had been almost warm toward her were now in possession of a story about her that wasn't false enough to disprove, but wasn't true enough to deserve. Ethan found out 20 minutes later from Hector, who had also been in town. He came into the kitchen without his coat, which meant he had come directly from wherever he was when Hector told him, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You heard," he said. "Tommy told me," Clara said. "I'll go talk to Carter." "No," Clara said, immediately, firmly. "Don't." He stopped. "If you go and confront him, it looks like you're protecting something," she said. "It looks like there's something that needs protecting, which tells people the story is true enough to make you angry." She turned to face him. "The best thing you can do right now is nothing." "I'm not good at nothing," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. "Do it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw moved the way it did when he was holding something back. "What he said about your father is a version of the truth being used as a weapon," Clara said. "My father made mistakes. He lost people's money. He died with more shame than he deserved and less peace than he'd earned. I can't change any of that." She paused. "What I can do is make sure that the way I live here is so clearly what it is that Carter's version of me becomes impossible to believe." "That takes time," Ethan said. "Everything worth anything takes time," Clara said. I was still looking at her with that expression, the one that had been getting harder to categorize over the past weeks. The one that had started as careful assessment and had moved slowly through something she didn't have a name for yet. "You're not angry," he said, like it was something he was trying to understand. "I'm furious," Clara said. "I'm just not going to let him see it. There's a difference." Something moved in Ethan's face, quick, warm, unmistakable. "Yes," he said, "there is." The town made its discomfort known in small ways over the following days. Mrs. Aldrich stopped her on the main street of Red Hollow on Wednesday, and was perfectly polite in the way that people are perfectly polite when they are withholding their full warmth, keeping it in reserve, waiting to see which way things settle. The dry goods store owner, Mr. Purvis, who had been chattily friendly since Clara's first visit, was quieter than usual when she came in for flour. Two of the ranch wives she had been building careful acquaintances with found reasons to be busy when she stopped by. Clara noticed all of it. She smiled at all of it. She thanked Mr. Purvis for his help, told Mrs. Aldrich her hat was lovely, and meant it left a jar of the late apple preserves she'd put up for the family of one of the ranch wives who she knew had a sick child. She kept showing up. On Friday something shifted. It shifted because of Red Storm, though not in the way anyone expected. Clara had been working with the stallion every morning without telling anyone what she was doing, or how far it had progressed. The small daily ceremonies of it had become something she guarded carefully, not out of secrecy, but out of an instinct that some things are damaged by being watched too closely before they're ready. What had started as standing at the fence had moved over 3 weeks to standing in the pasture with him at 10 feet, then 8, then close enough that she could hear him breathe. That Friday morning she was in the pasture with him when she heard the gate and turned to find that Ethan had come in quietly and was standing just inside it, still enough that Red Storm hadn't startled. But it wasn't Ethan who mattered in that moment. Behind him, just outside the gate, were Martha Greer and the Reverend Hale's wife Eleanor, who had come to the ranch for a reason Clara didn't know yet, and had apparently arrived at exactly the wrong moment or exactly the right one, depending on how you looked at it. Both women had stopped at the gate when they saw Clara in the pasture with the stallion. Red Storm knew they were there. His head came up and his ears went forward and his whole body tightened in the way it did when he felt a change in the air. Clara felt it through the hand she had resting lightly against his neck, and she didn't move. She kept her hand where it was, and she spoke to him quietly. Just his name, just a sound he had learned to associate with safety, and she felt him hesitate, the enormous tension of an animal deciding between instinct and trust, and then very slowly stand down. He lowered his head. He stayed. Martha Greer made a sound that was barely audible through the fence. Clara stood with the stallion for another full minute before she stepped back, carefully gave him the space he liked, and walked toward the gate. She kept her movement slow and deliberate until she was clear of him. Then she walked normally to where the others were. Hale was looking at her with an expression that had nothing performed about it. "How long have you been doing that?" she said. 3 weeks, Clara said. "My husband's brother is a horse trainer," Martha Greer said. She was looking back at Red Storm, who had drifted away to the far side of the pasture, but was watching them. "He tried to work with that animal last spring. Said he was unworkable." "He wasn't ready last spring," Clara said. "What changed?" Eleanor asked. Clara considered the question honestly. "I think he just needed someone to be patient enough," she said, "to not need anything from him before he was ready to give it." Martha Greer turned and looked at Clara with an expression that was different from any she had worn in Clara's presence before. The assessment was still there. It was probably always there. Clara thought for women who'd survived in small communities by reading people accurately, but something else had joined it. Something that might, given time, become respect. "You'll come to the women's social next Thursday," Martha said. It wasn't quite an invitation, and wasn't quite a command. It was something in between, offered in the way that practical women offer things directly, without ornamentation, take it or leave it. "I'd like that," Clara said. Eleanor smiled. "Good," she said. And the way she said it told Clara that Eleanor Hale had already made up her own mind about Carter's Sunday performance, and that in a town where the Reverend's wife's opinion carried weight, this was not a small thing. That afternoon, Ethan found Clara at the table going through the household accounts and sat down across from her. "What Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Hale saw this morning," he said. "I know," Clara said. "It helps." "It does more than help," he said. "Martha Greer talks to half the valley. Eleanor Hale talks to the other half. Then between the two of them, maybe Carter's version of events will have some competition," Clara said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about Carter," he said. "About why he's doing this. It's not just about you." "No," Clara agreed. "It's about you." He looked at her. "He thinks you have something now that makes him look like a fool," Clara said. "He rejected me at the station. You took me in. In 5 weeks the house is running, the ranch hands are better, and a horse nobody could work is letting me touch him." Carter decided something at that station, and he was wrong. And the way people in small places deal with being wrong is to make the thing they were wrong about seem less valuable. Ethan absorbed this. "You figured all that out on your own." "I grew up around men who couldn't admit mistakes," Clara said. "I recognize the patterns." He looked at the ledger open in front of her, then back up at her face. "What did your father do?" he said. "When things started going wrong, the business. Did you know it was happening?" Clara set her pen down. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "He stopped talking at dinner. My father always talked at dinner. He was a man who thought out loud, who worked through things by saying them. When he went quiet, I knew." She paused. "I asked him once. He said everything was fine. I knew it wasn't, but I was 19, and he was my father, and I didn't have the words yet to push past that." "What would you have done differently?" Ethan asked. "If you'd had the words." Clara thought about this. "I would have told him that his mistakes didn't change who he was to me," she said. "That I wasn't going to love him less because he failed at something. I think—" She stopped. "I think he was more afraid of my opinion than of the debt collectors. Of me seeing him as someone who'd failed. And because he was afraid to tell me, he carried it alone and it got too heavy." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan said. Clara met his eyes. "Because you do the same thing," she said. "You carry things alone because you've decided that's what strength looks like. You've been running this ranch for 16 years without letting anyone in far enough to help you carry anything. And I think your mother was the only person you ever let close enough to see the real weight of it. And when she died, you just closed the door." The silence that followed was different from the other silences. Ethan was very still. "That's a direct thing to say," he said. "You told me on the first day you preferred honesty," Clara said. "I'm holding you to that." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not wrong," he said. It came out quietly, like something he'd been waiting to admit for longer than he knew. "After my mother died, I didn't know what to do with—" He stopped. Started again. "She was the one who knew how to hold this place together. Not the work. I knew the work. But the feeling of it. The reason it mattered beyond the cattle count and the hay and the winter feed. I didn't know how to keep that alive without her. So you kept the ranch alive instead," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "That makes sense," she said. "You did what you knew how to do." "It wasn't enough," he said. "No," Clara said gently. "It wasn't. But it kept the door open long enough for something to change." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said the obvious thing that was sitting in the space between them, but both of them felt its weight warm and real and slightly terrifying. The disaster came on a Thursday night 11 days after Carter's Sunday performance. Clara woke to the sound of horses. Not the familiar movements of the ranch horses in the barn, but something harder, faster, the sound of animals being driven. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw in the dark yard below made everything in her go cold, and then immediately sharply alert. Torches. 3 of them. Moving along the south fence line. She was dressed and out of her room in under a minute. She ran into Ethan in the hallway, already pulling on his coat. "Stay in the house," he said. "No," she said. There was no time to argue it. He was already moving toward the door, and she was right behind him. What they found was bad and organized, which meant it was worse than an accident. 3 men faces covered horses. Unfamiliar had cut the south fence and were driving a portion of Ethan's cattle through the gap. The torches were not for seeing by. They were for keeping the dogs back and the horses frightened. Hector was already outside shouting. Tommy was trying to get a horse out of the barn. Joseph was nowhere visible, and then suddenly was coming from the far side of the barn, at a run, which meant he'd been sleeping in the hayloft, which he sometimes did, and had gone to cut around and come at them from behind. Ethan moved fast, and with the specific efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this kind of crisis in his head, even when he hoped he'd never live it. He went for the fence gap first, not the men the gap, and Clara understood immediately. Let the men go. Stop the cattle. Without the gap, they couldn't drive the herd through, and the whole operation collapsed. She ran for the gap from the other side. She got there at the same moment as Ethan from opposite directions, and they worked without speaking. Ethan, closing the broken fence section as much as he could. Clara getting herself between the remaining cattle and the gap, spreading her arms, making herself large the way she'd learned to do with Red Storm, projecting not panic, but authority. The cattle that had already been driven through were gone, maybe 30 head. But the men had not been able to take the main herd. One of the torches went out. Then another. Then she heard horses moving away fast into the dark, and then only the sound of the frightened cattle around her and Ethan's voice, steady and low, calling to Hector, calling to Tommy, taking count. Clara stood in the dark with her arms at her sides and breathed. Tommy appeared at her elbow. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Go count the horses." She went to Ethan. How was at the fence the broken section in his hands? In the dark, she couldn't read his expression, but she could hear him breathing the controlled breath of a man managing his anger very carefully. 30, maybe 35 head, Hector said from somewhere to the left. "They got them through before we came out." "The horses," Ethan said. "All accounted for," Tommy said. "Red Storm's gone." Everything went still. "Gone," Ethan repeated. "They opened the pasture gate," Tommy said. His voice was careful. "He bolted. He could be anywhere by now. In the dark in this country." Clara was already moving. "Clara?" Ethan's voice. She stopped. "You can't go into the hills in the dark," he said. "I'm not going into the hills," she said. "I'm going to the east pasture fence. He knows that fence. He's spent 8 weeks learning that fence is where safety is." She turned to look at Ethan. "If he's going to stop anywhere tonight, it's there." Silence. "I'll come with you," Ethan said. They walked to the east pasture fence in the dark, not speaking. The night was cold and clear and enormous around them. Clara moved to the fence line and stood there and called Red Storm's name, not loudly, just into the dark in the tone she always used, steady, warm, the particular voice she had developed over 8 weeks of standing still and waiting. Nothing. She called again. Ethan stood beside her and didn't say anything, which was exactly right, and she was grateful for it. 5 minutes. 10. Then a sound. Far off. Getting closer. And then Red Storm came out of the dark at a fast walk, head high, breathing hard, still frightened, but moving toward her voice, the way he'd learned to move toward it over 8 weeks of choosing trust, one small step at a time. He came to her hand. Clara let out a breath that she felt through her whole body. She heard Ethan make a sound beside her, barely audible, involuntary. She held the horse's face between her hands and pressed her forehead briefly against his and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. "How did you know he'd come back?" Ethan said, very quietly. "I didn't," Clara said. "But I knew the work we'd done was real. I trusted that." They stood there in the dark for a moment. "The men who came tonight," Clara said. "You know who sent them." "I know," Ethan said. "You can't prove it." "Not tonight," he said. "But Carter has been trying to take the South grazing rights from me for 4 years through legal means and failing. This is what comes next when a man like that runs out of legitimate options." "What do you do?" Clara said. "I keep the ranch running," he said. "I document everything. I get the cattle back if I can trace them. And I wait for Carter to make a mistake big enough that I don't need to prove it, everyone else can see it." "That's patient," Clara said. "I'm a patient man," he said. And then very quietly, "I learned it recently." Clara looked at him in the dark. She understood what he meant. She understood it completely, and the warmth it produced in her was complicated, real and frightening, and something she did not yet know what to do with. "We should get Red Storm back to the pasture," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. They walked back together, the horse between them through the dark and the cold, and Clara thought about patience, about 8 weeks of standing still and showing up and doing the work without knowing what it would come to, and she thought that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is simply refuse to leave. In the morning, when the full picture of the night's damage was visible, it was worse in some ways and better in others. 32 cattle confirmed gone. The south fence would need a full day's work to repair properly. Tommy had a bruised shoulder from a horse that spooked into him in the dark. But the main herd was intact. Red Storm was in his pasture. And Joseph, coming down from the hayloft in the gray early light, reported that he had recognized one of the horses, not the rider. The horse as belonging to a man named Dawes, who ran a small operation about 12 miles north and was known to take on work for Carter when Carter didn't want his own men attached to something. "Can you swear to that?" Ethan said. "I can swear I know that horse," Joseph said. "The rest is for other people to conclude." Ethan nodded. He rode into Red Hollow that morning and filed a report with the sheriff, a careful, detailed report naming what he knew and what he observed, keeping speculation out of it. The sheriff, a steady man named Briggs, who had held the job long enough to have no interest in making enemies of either Ethan Walker or William Carter, listened carefully and wrote everything down and said he would look into it. What Ethan did not do was accuse Carter directly. Clara watched him manage this, the restraint of it, the discipline required, and understood something about him that she hadn't fully articulated before. Ethan Walker was not a passive man. He was not a man who accepted injustice or looked away from it. But he was a man who understood that how you fight matters as much as whether you fight because a victory won badly is its own kind of loss. She was thinking about this when Martha Greer appeared at the ranch gate that afternoon, alone this time, without the social pretense of a pie or a visit. She came directly to Clara, who was in the yard assessing the damage to the south fence from the outside. "I heard what happened last night," Martha said. She had the look of a woman who has been doing some internal revision and is still in the middle of it. "Half the town heard by mid-morning." "It's a small valley," Clara said. "There's talk," Martha said, "about who was behind it." "There's always talk," Clara said. Martha looked at her steadily. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead," Clara said. "William Carter told people things about you," Martha said. "About your family in Baltimore. I listened. I'm telling you honestly, I listened and I thought about it." She paused. "Then I went home, and I thought about what I've actually seen of you in 8 weeks. And I want to know, were the things Carter said true?" Clara met her eyes. "My father made mistakes that hurt people financially," she said. "That's true. My father was also a man who spent his life trying to do right by his family and his neighbors and got in over his head and couldn't get out. That's also true. Carter is using one truth to hide the other." Martha was quiet for a long moment. "My husband made a bad investment 12 years ago," she said. "We nearly lost everything. The people who'd called us friends for 20 years treated us like we had a disease." Her voice was even, but Clara heard what was underneath it. "I know what it looks like when someone uses a person's worst moment as a weapon." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "I didn't know." "No reason you should," Martha said. "I'm telling you because—" She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I'm telling you because I was one of the people listening to Carter on Sunday, and I should have said something then, and I didn't. And that sits poorly with me." Clara looked at this woman, this sharp-eyed, sweet-voiced woman, who she had initially read as an obstacle, and who was turning out to be something considerably more complicated and more valuable. "You're saying something now," Clara said. Martha straightened. "I am," she said. "Eleanor Hale and I have been talking. We think it's time the women of this community made their own judgment clear. Separate from their husbands. Separate from Carter's money and whatever influence he thinks he has." She looked at Clara directly. "You'll come to the social on Thursday?" "You already invited me," Clara said. "I'm inviting you again," Martha said. With different intentions than the first time. Clara understood. "Thank you," she said, and meant it the way she had meant thank you when Ethan told her the latch on her door would stay. Martha nodded, turned and walked back toward her horse with the decisive step of a woman who has made up her mind and is done revisiting it. Clara stood by the damaged fence in the afternoon light and felt the territory shifting under her feet, not the physical ground, but the human ground, the complicated terrain of belonging, which she had never managed to find back east, and which was against all reasonable expectation beginning to form itself here. That evening, Ethan sat across from her at the kitchen table after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and they went through the damage accounts together. What was lost, what needed to be repaired, what the recovery would cost, and how long it would take. He worked through numbers with the focused efficiency of a man who has done difficult accounting many times before, and Clara kept pace with him, making notes, asking questions, offering the kind of practical input that came from 8 weeks of knowing exactly what the ranch needed and what it could absorb. At one point he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. He stopped again. "3 months ago I was sitting at this table alone doing these numbers." "And now you're not," Clara said. "And now I'm not," he said. The way he said it was simple and quiet and completely without performance, and it landed in Clara's chest with the weight of something real. She looked down at her notes. She was not going to rush this. She had learned from her father from the farm from Red Storm that the most important things in life cannot be rushed into without ruining them. They had to be allowed to develop at their own pace under honest conditions without the pressure of expectation distorting their shape. But she was also aware with a clarity that surprised her by how calm it felt that she was sitting in a kitchen that she had made warm again, in a house that had learned to breathe again across from a man who had taught himself to stop running from his own life, and that the 3 months she had agreed to were going to come to an end in less than 4 weeks. And that the question of what happened after that was the most important thing currently living in the silence between them. She kept her eyes on her notes. She kept her handwriting steady. And she let the silence hold what it was holding, because some things need to be carried a little longer before they're ready to be put down. The 3-month mark arrived on a Wednesday. Clara knew the date. She had known it for 2 weeks the way you know about a thing that is coming without letting yourself look at it directly, keeping it in your peripheral vision, aware of it, not ready to face it. She woke that morning before the sun, the same way she woke every morning, and started the kitchen fire, and put the coffee on, and stood at the window while the water heated, and looked at the dark outline of the hills to the north, and understood that today was the day Ethan had promised to help her leave if she wanted to go. He had kept every promise he made on that platform. The room, the wage, the work. All of it exactly as he said. She heard his boots on the hall floor at 5:30, same as every morning. Heard him pause at this kitchen doorway, the same way he always paused, not to announce himself, but to read the room before entering, a habit she had come to recognize as one of the most fundamental things about him. He came in and poured his coffee and sat down across from her, and neither of them said anything for a full minute. "Wednesday," he said finally. "Wednesday," she said. He held his cup in both hands and looked at it. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want to say it right, so give me a moment." Clara waited. He looked up. "When I made that offer on the platform," he said, "I was telling the truth. 3 months fair wage, and I'd help you go wherever you wanted after. I meant every word of it. I still mean it." He paused. "What I didn't expect was—" He stopped, looked at his coffee, looked back at her. "I didn't expect you. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't looking for anything beyond a practical arrangement, and I think you know that." "I know that," Clara said. "What I'm trying to say," Ethan said, and something in his voice shifted, less controlled, more real, the specific quality of a man who is not used to saying the thing that matters most and is doing it anyway, "is that this ranch is different from what it was 3 months ago. Not because of the curtains or the garden or the accounts, though all of those matter. It's different because—" He stopped again. "Say it," Clara said quietly. "Because you're in it," he said. "And I don't know how to go back to what it was before, and I'm not sure I want to. But I need to know what you want. Not what you think you should want. Not what makes practical sense. What you actually want." Clara looked at him across the table. She had rehearsed nothing. She had decided sometime in the past 2 weeks that whatever she said this morning would not be rehearsed, because the most important things she had ever said in her life had been unrehearsed, and the most dishonest ones had been prepared in advance. "I want to stay," she said. He was very still. "Not because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I've had nowhere to go before, and it never made me want to stay anywhere. I want to stay because this is the first place I've been in years where I feel like myself. Not a version of self that's managing or surviving, or waiting for something bad to happen. Just myself." She paused. "And because you are the first person I've met in a long time who looked at me and saw what was actually there." Something moved in Ethan's face that she had never seen there before in quite that form. Not the almost smile, not the careful recalibration, but something more open and more vulnerable and more true. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "No," Clara said. "The timing was right. We both needed the time." "I'm not an easy man to live with," he said. "I know that. I close off. I carry things alone without meaning to. I'm better at action than at—" He gestured vaguely. "Words," Clara said. "Words," he confirmed. "You've been using words just fine this morning," she said. "It's taking everything I have," he said. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and she saw it surprise him too, the sudden release of it in the kitchen. And then she watched him smile. Not the almost smile. A real one, full and unguarded, the first she had seen, and it changed his face so completely that she felt she was seeing him for the first time, and had somehow known him forever simultaneously. "We could try," she said. "An arrangement more permanent than 3 months, if you want." "That's not quite what I'm asking," he said. She looked at him. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. Flat and direct and entirely without decoration, which was the only way Ethan Walker knew how to say the most important things. "Not because it's practical, not because the ranch needs it, because I want to choose you, every day, and I want to do it properly." Clara was quiet. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to come over the hills. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "Yes," he said. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that in the early morning quiet of the kitchen that Clara had brought back to life, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because neither of them needed to. The news traveled through Red Hollow by noon. In a town that size, good news travels almost as fast as bad. And this particular piece of news had the added velocity of its own narrative satisfaction. The rejected mail-order bride and the solitary mountain rancher. The platform rejection that everyone had witnessed, the 3 months of work, and the slow, quiet evidence of a life taking shape. People who had whispered about Clara at the station were now recasting the whole story in a different light, the way people do when the ending arrives, and they realized they had been watching the wrong thing. Martha Greer appeared at the ranch gate before supper. She brought Eleanor Hale with her. And she brought a bottle of brandy, which was so unlike anything Clara would have predicted from Martha Greer that she almost didn't know what to do with it. "We heard," Martha said. Her voice had a warmth in it that was new and genuine. "We thought it appropriate to mark the occasion." "How did you hear already?" Clara said. "Tommy told the man at the feed store," Martha said. "The man at the feed store told his wife. His wife told me." She paused. "This is a small valley." "So everyone has said," Clara said, and held the door open. Eleanor hugged her. It was brief and firm and completely unexpected, and Clara stood in her own kitchen, being hugged by the Reverend's wife, and felt with a clarity that was almost overwhelming that she had arrived. Not at the ranch, not at Montana, but at something she had not let herself believe in for long enough that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be believed in. Tommy knocked on the kitchen door 20 minutes later with his hat in his hands and his gap-toothed smile at full force. "Congratulations," he said. "I figured you'd both get there eventually. I want it noted that I had faith from the beginning." "You told me you thought I'd last 2 weeks," Clara said. "I said that to Hector," Tommy said. "To you, I always had faith." He paused. "I may have also told the feed store." "I know you told the feed store, Tommy." "Right," he said. "Well, congratulations anyway." Joseph came last at the end of the day, when the visitors had gone, and the kitchen was quieter. He stood in the doorway with the specific stillness of a man carrying something he is deciding how to put down. "I got a letter," he said. Clara looked up. "From Alice," he said. "She wants to bring the boy to meet me. She wants to come in the spring." He paused. She said she was glad I wrote, that she'd been waiting a long time for me to write." Clara set down what she was doing. Joseph's face was doing something complicated and controlled, and almost losing the battle with both. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "because you're the one who—" He stopped, started differently. "You're the reason I wrote." "You wrote it," Clara said. "I just held the pen." "No," Joseph said. "You held more than that." He looked at her steadily. "You're good for this place. You're good for Walker. I want you to know that somebody noticed." Clara looked at this man 6 years at the ranch, 6 years of carrying his daughter's name like a weight, 6 years of minimum words and maximum loyalty, and felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite gratitude, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Thank you, Joseph," she said. He nodded once, turned to go, then turned back. "Spring's a good time for a wedding," he said. "If you haven't decided." And then he was gone before she could respond, which was so completely and perfectly Joseph that she stood in the kitchen and laughed for the second time that day. The trouble with Carter did not end with the engagement. In some ways, it got worse. The 32 cattle that had been taken in the night raid were traced through Sheriff Briggs's methodical investigation to a holding pen 12 miles north, exactly where Joseph had suggested on the property of the man named Dawes. Dawes claimed he had purchased them legitimately and produced paperwork that had clearly been prepared in advance, which was the kind of thing that is very difficult to disprove quickly when a man has resources to devote to the paperwork. Carter's name did not appear anywhere in the official record, but the Valley knew. The Valley always knew in the way that small, close communities know things that can't be proven through tone and pattern, and the specific quality of Carter's silence on the matter, which was too comfortable for someone who had nothing to hide. Ethan filed additional claims. He hired a lawyer from Helena the nearest city, with the kind of legal resources the situation required, and began building the kind of case that takes patience and documentation, and the willingness to move slowly when every instinct says to move fast. Clara watched all of this and stayed out of the legal mechanics of it because she understood that it wasn't her place, and because Ethan needed to handle it the way he needed to handle things, with full control, without well-intentioned interference. What she did instead was the thing she was best at. She kept the human world of the ranch functioning with enough warmth and enough steadiness that the legal anxiety around the edges of their days didn't poison the center of them. It was during this period that Carter made his biggest mistake. Not legally, not with the cattle, something much smaller and much more revealing. He came to the Women's Thursday social. Not Carter himself. His wife Harriet, who was a quiet woman in her 50s with the look of someone who had spent a long time making herself small. Harriet Carter came to the social and sat beside Martha Greer and said nothing controversial for the first hour, and Clara, who was there herself for the fourth consecutive week, was trying to decide whether to feel sorry for her or cautious of her when Harriet leaned across and said quietly, in a voice that was clearly not intended to carry, "My husband is afraid of you." Clara turned to look at her. Harriet Carter's expression was not conspiratorial. It was exhausted. The exhaustion of a woman who has lived for decades inside someone else's version of events. "Of me specifically," Clara said. "Of what you represent," Harriet said. He looked at Walker's ranch, and he saw something declining. He thought if he waited long enough, Walker would have to sell. The South grazing rights, the water access, eventually the land. She paused. "Then you came and things stopped declining." "Things stopped declining because there was work that needed doing," Clara said carefully. "I did the work." "I know," Harriet said. "William knows too. That's what frightens him." She looked down at her hands. "He's not a bad man exactly. He's a man who decided a long time ago what he was entitled to, and when people don't fall in line with that..." She stopped. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara said. "Because he's going to try one more thing," Harriet said. "I don't know what it is, but I know him. When the legal approach fails and the social approach fails, there's always one more thing. I thought you should be ready." Clara looked at this woman, this quiet, tired woman who had come to a Thursday social and said the bravest thing she had probably said in years, and felt the particular weight of it. "Thank you," she said. Harriet nodded and turned back to her tea, and that was the end of the conversation, but it sat with Clara for the rest of the day and into the night. And when she told Ethan that evening what Harriet had said, she watched something shift in his expression. Not surprise, but a settling and a preparation. "One more thing," he said. "That's what she said," Clara said. She didn't know what. Ethan was quiet. "It'll be the water," he said. "There's a creek that runs through the northeast corner of my property. It feeds the main pasture through summer. Carter has been claiming for years that he has prior rights to it. It's been in dispute since before my father died. If he can file a new claim with the territorial court while we're occupied with the cattle case." "He splits your attention," Clara said. "And the legal costs," Ethan said. "Two simultaneous cases at this distance from Helena, the travel alone would drain what he can't drain any other way." "Can he do that?" Clara said. "File a new claim." "He can file anything he wants to file," Ethan said. "Whether it holds is a different question, but the filing itself is enough to create problems." Clara thought about Harriet Carter sitting across from her with her tired hands and her exhausted voice and her small, precise act of loyalty to someone she barely knew. "What does he actually want?" she said. "At the bottom of all of it. Not the land, not the water rights. What does he actually want?" Ethan looked at her. "To win," he said. "That's all it ever is with men like Carter. It stopped being about the land or the cattle or the water a long time ago. He wants to be the man who won." "Then we make sure winning doesn't look the way he imagined it," Clara said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "He wants you broken or gone," she said. "So you be neither. You let him file what he files, and you keep the ranch running, and you get married in the spring, in front of everyone in this valley who has been watching and deciding whose story they believe. And you make it so clear, so undeniable, that this place is alive and strong and full, that winning against it becomes impossible to imagine. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I thought when you told me about Carter's letter, the one about your father, I thought you might fall apart." "I considered it," Clara said, "but you didn't." "No. And now Carter's wife is warning you about his next move," Ethan said. "You've been here 3 months and you've changed the ranch, held off one raid, redirected 2 of my ranch hands' lives in ways I didn't see coming, and turned the most influential women in Red Hollow from skeptics to allies." He paused. "And you started all of that from a train platform with 1 trunk." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say," she said, "that the only way to change where you are is to start exactly where you are. Not where you wish you were. Not where you think you deserve to be. Exactly where you are." She paused. "I was on a platform with 1 trunk and $11 and a rejected marriage contract. That was where I was, so that's where I started." Ethan looked at her with everything he was feeling visible in his face in a way that would not have been possible 3 months ago. Because 3 months ago, Ethan Walker had not been a man who let things be visible in his face, and the change was not small. "I love you," he said. Just that. No preamble, no build-up. Just the words said with the same flat directness he used for everything that mattered most. Clara felt the words land in her chest and stay there. "I know," she said. He almost laughed. "That's all?" "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." She looked at him steadily. "I love you too. I have for longer than either of us would probably find comfortable to calculate." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Spring," he said. "Spring?" she agreed. Carter filed the water rights claim on a Friday in early November, exactly as Ethan had predicted. The papers arrived via the Territorial Courier on a gray morning when the first real cold had settled into the hills and the horse's breath made clouds in the air. Ethan read the filing at the kitchen table with Clara beside him, and she watched him read it and waited. He set it down. He sat for a moment. "It's exactly what I thought it would be," he said. "The claims are thin. He's citing records from 1871 that are at best ambiguous. Our lawyer will be able to counter them, but it will take time and money and trips to Helena, and it's time to overlap with the cattle case." He looked at the papers again. "He's thought it through." "So have we," Clara said. Ethan looked at her. "Write to the lawyer today," she said. "Tell him what's happening and ask him to review the counterclaim strategy for both cases together. 2 cases run together are cheaper than 2 cases run separately if the same lawyer handles both. And send the letter today, not tomorrow, so Carter doesn't get a week's head start on the framing." Ethan reached for paper without saying anything. She watched him write, and while he wrote, she pulled the household account ledger toward her and began looking at what they could realistically redirect toward legal costs without cutting what the ranch needed to stay healthy through winter. It was a tight calculation, and it required moving things around in ways that would be uncomfortable for a few months, but it was doable, and when she put the numbers in front of Ethan an hour later, he looked at them for a long time and said nothing. "It works," she said. "It's tight, but it works." "I know," he said. "I'm looking at what you did with the winter supply budget." "I reorganized it 2 weeks ago," she said. "I had a feeling we might need the room." He looked up from the ledger. "You anticipated this 2 weeks ago." "Harriet Carter told me one more thing was coming," Clara said. "I didn't know what it was, but I know what expensive things look like in a budget, and I thought it was better to be ready." Ethan set the ledger down. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He looked at her with an expression that had no edge to it, no restraint, no careful management of what he was letting show. "What would I have done without you?" he said. "Managed," she said. "You were always going to manage. That was never in question." "That's not the same as this," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." They sent the letter to Helena that afternoon. The weeks that followed were tight, in the way that difficult periods are tight, not unbearable, but constant, requiring daily attention and daily decision-making, and the kind of patience that isn't passive, but is its own form of action. The lawyer in Helena proved as good as his reputation. Sheriff Briggs continued his investigation with the slow thoroughness of a man who intends to be right rather than fast. Joseph wrote to Alice and received 2 more letters in return, each one a little warmer, each one a little longer. Tommy got into a brief and passionate argument with Hector about the best way to repair the south fence's corner post, which Clara settled by asking them both to explain their methods to her, and then selecting the one that was clearly superior, which happened to be Hector's, and Tommy accepted this with the grace of a man who knows he lost fairly. Red Storm learned to accept a blanket. This was significant. The blanket was the first piece of gear the stallion had allowed, and Clara spent 3 days on it, working in the slow, methodical way she had learned over 3 months of daily patience, offering, withdrawing, waiting, trying again, never forcing. When he finally stood still and let her settle the blanket across his back, Tommy watched from the fence with his mouth open. "That horse," Tommy said, "will end up gentler than our other horses." "No," Clara said, bringing the blanket off carefully, not pushing for more today. "He'll end up himself, just without the fear." Tommy thought about this. "Is that different?" "It's everything different," Clara said. Ethan was at the fence too. He had been watching her work with the horse for 20 minutes without announcing himself, which she had learned to recognize as one of his ways of paying attention, showing up quietly, staying at the edge, not intruding. "He's going to be a good horse," Ethan said. "He already is," Clara said. "People just couldn't see it past the fear." She gave Red Storm the space he needed and walked back to the fence, and Ethan fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the house. "Sheriff Briggs was here while you were with the horse," Ethan said. Clara looked at him. "He's got enough on Dawes to charge him," Ethan said. "He's being careful about how he proceeds because he wants the charge to hold. But he told me something else." He paused. "He told me that he's been talking to Carter's former foreman. A man who left Carter's employ in the spring, under circumstances that apparently weren't entirely voluntary. This man is interested in talking." Clara stopped walking. "How interested?" she said. "Interested enough to have asked Briggs what protection is available for someone who cooperates with a legal investigation," Ethan said. They looked at each other. "Carter's afraid," Clara said. "Yes," Ethan said. "I think he has been for a while, since the night raid failed, since the women's social, since—" He paused. "Since it became clear that this ranch isn't going to decline." "Harriet tried to warn us," Clara said. "She warned you," Ethan said. "I think Harriet Carter has been surviving on small acts of bravery for a long time. I think that one cost her." "Should we do something for her?" Clara said. Ethan was quiet. "I don't know what we could do that wouldn't make things worse for her," he said. "If Carter saw—" "No," Clara agreed. "You're right. Not yet." They walked in silence for a moment. "Ethan," she said. "Yes. Whatever happens with Carter, with the legal cases, with all of it, this ranch is going to be fine." He glanced at her. "You sound certain." "I am certain," she said. "Not because the legal cases will go our way, though I think they will, but because the things that make a place strong aren't the things that can be taken in a night raid or damaged by a court filing." She paused. "Tommy and Hector and Joseph are loyal to this place because they're valued in it. Martha Greer and Eleanor Hale are allied with us because of what they've seen. Red Storm trusts me because we did the work. None of those things can be stolen." Ethan was quiet for the length of several steps. "My father would have liked you," he said. "He would never have admitted it, but he would have." "High praise from a hard man," Clara said. "The highest," Ethan said. They reached the porch, and she went up the steps first and held the door, and as he came through she caught the look on his face, that open, unguarded, completely real expression that still surprised her every time she saw it, because it belonged to a man she had watched teach himself to wear it one honest conversation at a time. The kitchen was warm. The curtains she had made in dark gold let the late afternoon light come through in that particular way. She had come to love about this room at this hour, the way it made everything it touched look like something worth keeping. She put the kettle on. He sat at the table and opened the current ledger, and they worked together through the last hour of daylight, the way they had been working together for weeks now, side by side, each carrying their part, neither of them needing the other to be something they weren't. Outside, the hills were going dark in the early winter evening. Inside, the kitchen held its warmth. And the 3 months that had begun on a train platform with a rejected promise and one wooden trunk had become something neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them recognized. Something that was going to last. The winter that year was harder than anyone had predicted. It came early, moved in fast, and settled over the valley with the particular authority of a Montana winter that has decided not to negotiate. The creek in the northeast corner froze in the first week of December, which solved the water rights dispute in the most immediate sense. No water flowing meant nothing to argue over until spring, but created a different problem, which was the daily work of keeping livestock watered through ice that had to be broken twice a day every day, in temperatures that made the air itself feel hostile. Clara broke ice every morning at 5, alongside Tommy and Hector, working the creek line, while Ethan managed the barn rotation and Joseph handled the feed distribution. She wore 2 pairs of gloves and her heaviest coat, and came in every morning with her hands aching and her face raw and a specific private satisfaction in the cold. The satisfaction of hard work, done in honest conditions, of a body that did what was asked of it, of a day that began with something real. She did not complain about the cold. She had complained about nothing since arriving, which Hector had once told her was either her greatest strength or the thing most likely to concern him, and she had told him it was neither. It was simply that she had enough genuine problems to occupy her attention without manufacturing grievances on top of them. On a Thursday morning in the second week of December, Ethan came in from the barn with a letter, not from the lawyer in Helena, which was what she expected. They had been corresponding regularly with the lawyer. The cases were progressing. The news was cautiously good. This letter was different. It was from a woman named Margaret in Chicago, who wrote on behalf of a charitable organization that assisted women traveling west under mail-order arrangements, and who had somehow learned Clara's story through what chain of sources Clara couldn't imagine and wanted to share it. Margaret wrote that she had heard about the woman who arrived at Red Hollow Station and was rejected publicly and refused to be broken by it. She wrote that several women in her organization were facing similar circumstances. Women considering the journey west, uncertain of what they would find, frightened of what could go wrong. She asked with a formality that Clara found touching whether Clara would be willing to write a letter that could be shared with these women. Not advice necessarily, just the truth of what she had found. Clara read it twice. Then she handed it to Ethan. He read it, set it down, looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to write the letter," she said immediately. "I want to tell them the truth. Not the easy version, the real version." "The real version includes the hard parts," he said. "That's why it'll be worth reading," she said. She wrote the letter that evening after supper at the kitchen table, with Ethan reading at the other end and occasionally looking up at her with an expression she didn't interrupt. She wrote about the platform. She wrote about the trunk and the $11 and the cold practicality of Ethan's offer. She wrote about the ranch hands who became a family, about the horse that taught her that trust is not a feeling, but a practice. She wrote about Carter and the letter and the night raid and the cold and the ice and the legal cases and the mornings that were hard and the evenings that were worth every hard morning. She wrote about what it meant to find a place where you were valued, not for what you brought to the table, but for who you were when you sat down at it. She did not write about the proposal. She left that private. When she finished, she read it back to herself once. Then she handed it across the table to Ethan. He read it in silence. When he put it down, he didn't say anything for a moment. "What?" she said. "You should have been a writer," he said. "I'm a rancher's wife," she said, "and I'm very good at it." He smiled, the real one, the full one, the one that had taken 3 months to appear and now came easily. "Send it," he said. She folded it and addressed the envelope and set it by the door for the morning post. Outside, the winter pressed against the house, and inside the lamps burned warm. The legal cases broke in February, not slowly, not incrementally, but in the sudden way that things break when enough pressure has been building beneath the surface for long enough. Carter's former foreman, the man who had asked Sheriff Briggs about protection for cooperating witnesses, came forward in the first week of February with a deposition that was specific and detailed and directly connected the night raid on Walker Ranch to Carter's instructions. The foreman's name was Dale Purcell, and he had worked for Carter for 11 years and left as Briggs had suggested, under circumstances that were not voluntary. Purcell was a careful man, not angry, not looking for revenge. He had the quality of someone who had simply reached the limit of what his conscience could carry and had decided to put it down. His statement named Carter explicitly in the planning of the raid. It described conversations he had personally witnessed. It connected the man named Dawes to Carter through 3 specific meetings on Carter's property. Ethan received the news from Sheriff Briggs on a Tuesday afternoon and came directly into the house and found Clara. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. "Purcell gave a full deposition," he said. "Briggs is filing charges by the end of the week. Carter will be arrested." He paused. "The water rights case will almost certainly be dropped once the criminal charges are filed. Carter's lawyer won't be able to maintain both." Clara stood very still. "It's done," she said, hearing it fully this time. "It's done," Ethan said. She sat down. She had not realized how much weight she had been carrying until the moment it lifted, not all at once, but in a wave that moved through her from shoulders to chest to hands. And she sat at the kitchen table and breathed, and did not cry, because she was not a woman who cried easily. But she felt the specific physical release of it, the way a body acknowledges the end of something it has been holding against. Ethan sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He just sat with her the way she had sat with him through the difficult months, and she understood what it cost a man like him to have learned to do that, to be still when he wanted to act, to offer presence instead of solution. And she loved him for it in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. "Harriet Carter," she said finally. "I know," Ethan said. "She needs someone should—" "I'll talk to Briggs," Ethan said. "There are ways to ensure she's protected in whatever comes next. She'll have options." "She was brave," Clara said. "Yes," Ethan said. "She was." They sat quietly for a moment. "Spring," Clara said. He understood. "Spring," he said. The wedding was held on the second Saturday in April. Reverend Hale performed the ceremony in the yard of Walker Ranch, which Eleanor Hale had quietly campaigned for, and which Ethan had agreed to on the grounds that the church in Red Hollow was too small, and he wasn't going to ask half the valley to stand outside a building when there was perfectly good open land available. The whole valley came, not out of obligation, not out of the compelled attendance that operates in small communities where people come to events because they can't afford not to be seen, but because they wanted to be there, because the story had become something the community had a stake in, because watching a woman arrive with one trunk and leave nothing unchanged had reminded people of something they wanted to be reminded of. Tommy wore a clean shirt that Clara suspected he had purchased specifically for the occasion. Hector stood very straight the entire ceremony, with the look of a man determined not to let his emotions do anything embarrassing. Joseph stood slightly apart from the crowd, the way he always stood, but he was there, and when Clara passed him on her way to where Ethan was standing, Joseph gave her a nod that meant more than most speeches. Martha Greer cried. She cried silently, and with great dignity, and pretended afterward that she had not, and Eleanor Hale very kindly did not contradict her. Ethan stood and watched Clara walk toward him across the yard of the ranch his father had built and his mother had loved, and whatever was happening in his face was not something he tried to manage or control. Clara saw it from 20 feet away and held it in her eyes all the way to him. She stood in front of him. He looked at her. "You're here," he said, very quietly, just to her. "I told you I was staying," she said. Reverend Hale cleared his throat gently. They both turned to him, and the ceremony began. What happened after was not the dramatic transformation that stories sometimes describe, not a sudden revolution, not a single moment that divided everything into before and after. It was something better and more durable than that. It was the daily accumulation of a life that kept getting richer. Red Storm was worked under saddle for the first time in May. Clara did it herself with Ethan and Tommy and Hector, all watching from the fence, and the horse was not perfectly calm. There was a tense moment early on when something in the distant hills spooked him, and she felt the enormous power of him gather beneath her, and she said his name once, steady and clear, and felt him listen, and then he settled. He carried her around the pasture 3 times before she brought him back to the fence, and when she dismounted, Tommy made a sound that was definitely not a sob, and Hector said something in Spanish that she suspected was reverent. "He's ready," Clara said. "He's been ready for a while," Ethan said. He was waiting for the right rider. She handed the reins to Tommy and walked through the gate to where Ethan was standing, and he put his arm around her shoulders, the way he had learned to do. Still slightly careful, always intentional, never casual. And they stood and watched the horse that nobody thought could be ridden walk calmly around the pasture with Tommy on his back, looking like the happiest 20-year-old in the Montana Territory. Alice arrived in June with the baby. Joseph received the news that morning from the courier with a stillness so complete that Clara, watching from the kitchen doorway, was frightened for a moment that something was wrong. Then Joseph looked up from the letter, and his face did something she had never seen it do, something wide open, something unmanaged, something that was simply joy without armor, and she understood. "She's coming today," he said. "She's already on the train. She didn't know if I'd say yes if she asked first." "She knows you," Clara said. "She does," Joseph said. And his voice cracked on it just slightly, and he turned away to compose himself, and Clara went back into the kitchen and gave him the time. Alice arrived at 4 in the afternoon in a wagon from Red Hollow Station. Joseph was waiting at the ranch gate. The baby, 8 months old now, a round-faced, solemn boy, who was apparently considering whether the large, quiet man at the gate was interesting, reached toward Joseph with one fat hand. Joseph took it, that was all. He just stood there and held his grandson's hand and said nothing, and Alice stood beside him and cried quietly, and Clara watched from the porch and felt the specific weight of a moment that has been a long time coming and is exactly as good as it should be. Ethan appeared beside her. "Worth sending a letter," he said. "Everything good started with someone being brave enough to send a letter," Clara said. He looked at her. "Like a woman in Baltimore who answered a marriage advertisement." "Like that," she said. They stood on the porch of the house that Clara had brought back to warmth and watched Joseph hold his grandson in the afternoon light of a Montana June. And neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. The summer brought changes that were large and small, and all of them good. Sheriff Briggs completed his case against Carter in July. The charges were serious theft, conspiracy, filing fraudulent legal claims. Carter's lawyer negotiated a settlement that avoided the worst of the criminal exposure, but required Carter to make financial restitution for the stolen cattle, to formally withdraw all claims against Walker Ranch's water rights, and to sign a document acknowledging the legitimacy of Ethan's property boundaries that had been in dispute for 4 years. Carter signed it on a Wednesday morning at the sheriff's office with the expression of a man who has lost and knows it and has chosen the final dignity of accepting the loss cleanly rather than extending it. Ethan did not gloat. He came home that Wednesday afternoon and told Clara what had been signed, and they sat with it for a few minutes in the kitchen, and then Clara asked if he wanted coffee, and he said yes, and she put the kettle on, and that was the extent of their celebration, which was exactly right for both of them. What happened to Harriet Carter mattered to Clara more than what happened to Carter. Briggs had been true to his word. She had been protected from direct implication in her husband's actions, and she had cooperated quietly with the investigation in a way that the legal record would not make explicit, but that Briggs understood and honored. In September, Harriet Carter was visited by Eleanor Hale and Martha Greer, who extended to her the specific practical warmth of women who understand what it means to need a hand that doesn't ask too much. Whether Harriet found her way to a new life was not something Clara could know for certain, but she knew that Martha Greer, who was not a woman given to empty gestures, had made a specific point of including Harriet in the Thursday social, without announcement or drama, simply as a matter of course. It was the kindest possible way to offer someone a door. Autumn came, and the ranch was ready for it. The preparations were the most organized they had been since before Ethan's mother died. The root cellar full, the smokehouse properly sealed and in use. The winter supply calculations, tight and accurate, the livestock in good health, the fencing on all 4 sides solid. Ethan went through the inventory with Clara and confirmed what she already knew from her own review, and she had the private satisfaction of a person whose work is visible in solid, countable things. "We're in good shape," Ethan said. "We are," she said. Better than last year, he said. Better than the 5 years before that. Better than they needed to be, she said. In case it's a hard winter. He looked at her. Are you expecting a hard winter? I'm always expecting a hard winter, she said. That way I'm either prepared or pleasantly surprised. He laughed. The comfortable, easy laugh of a man who had relearned how to use it. My mother said almost exactly that, he said. Every October. Then it's good advice that runs in the family, Clara said. And now it runs in yours again. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he had made on the morning of the 3-month mark. But different now. Not the tentative offering of something fragile, but the steady, deliberate touch of a man who has made his choice and keeps making it every morning. On an October evening, when the first real cold of the new autumn had settled in, and the kitchen fire was going strong, and the lamps were lit against the early dark. Tommy knocked on the kitchen door with something in his hand. A letter, he said. Courier brought it this afternoon. Didn't want to interrupt earlier. It was addressed to Clara Walker. She had been receiving letters with that name for 4 months, and the slight warm shock of it had not yet worn off. This one was from Margaret in Chicago, the woman who ran the organization for women traveling west. She wrote to tell Clara that her letter, the one written at the kitchen table in December, with Ethan reading at the other end, had been copied and shared, and had reached as best they could count more than 200 women in the past 10 months. She wrote that 3 women who had read it and been discouraged from the journey had ultimately made it west. She wrote that one of those women had written to Margaret to say that Clara's letter was the reason she got back on the train after a difficult first stop. Clara read this sitting at the kitchen table while Ethan waited and Tommy hovered in the doorway pretending not to be curious. She finished the letter. Set it down. What does it say? Ethan said. She told him. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. 200 women, Ethan said. At least, Clara said. You wrote that letter in one evening, he said. I had a lot of material, she said. Tommy made a sound in the doorway. That's something, he said. That's really something, Clara. She looked at the ladder in her hand, and then at the kitchen around her. The curtains in dark gold, the herbs drying by the window, the warm light, the coffee tin she had labeled in her own handwriting, the account ledgers on the shelf, the small tin of dried lavender that had been her mother's, and was now on this windowsill in Montana, and she thought about a woman on a train from Chicago, heading somewhere uncertain, reading a letter that told her the honest truth, deciding to keep going. It's what I would have wanted, she said. If someone had sent me something true before I left. Ethan looked at her with everything he felt for her on his face, open and unguarded, the face of a man who had spent years protecting himself from exactly this kind of feeling, and had finally understood that the protection cost more than the risk. What you've built here, he said. This ranch, these people, what you did with Harriet Carter, with Joseph, with that horse, and now this. He paused. You walked off that train with nothing, and you filled everything. Not nothing, Clara said. I had a trunk. Clara. And a tin of lavender, she said. Clara. His voice was serious and warm and entirely real. She looked at him. I know, she said, softly. I know what you mean. He nodded. Outside, the autumn was settling into the hills, the long, slow turning of the season that would bring winter and then spring again. Another spring with Joseph's Alice and the baby, coming back for a longer visit with Red Storm Sound, and strong, and beginning to show Tommy the specific pleasure of a horse that has chosen to carry you with the south fence, solid, the root cellar full. The accounts in order, and the ranch breathing with the particular steady rhythm of a place that has remembered what it is for. Clara Walker had crossed the American West as a mail-order bride with $11 one trunk and a promise that had been broken before she finished crossing it. She had arrived with nothing that anyone in Red Hollow valued. She had built from exactly that, nothing. A life so full and so genuine and so deeply rooted in the lives of everyone around her that the valley could not now imagine what it had looked like before she came. And the greatest thing she had built was not the warm kitchen, not the solid accounts, not the relationships with Martha and Eleanor, and the community that had slowly, honestly come around. Not even what she and Ethan had made together, though. That was the truest and most important thing. The greatest thing Clara Walker built was what she proved. That a person is not the sum of what they lost. That value cannot be determined at a train station by a man in a good coat with shallow eyes. That the most transformative thing any person can do in a broken situation is refuse to be broken by it, not through defiance or performance, but through the daily quiet radical act of showing up and doing honest work and treating the people around you as though they matter, because they do. That trust is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is built in small steps over patient time, and it can survive almost anything if the person offering it never stops showing up. That a home is not a building or a piece of land or a legal arrangement. A home is what happens when someone who has been lost finds the place where they are truly seen and decides every single day to stay. And on that October evening, with the fire going strong, and the letter from Chicago in her hand, and Ethan's hand warm over hers, on the kitchen table, Clara Walker was exactly where she had always been heading. She was home.